Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. A while back, I wrote a video essay about the Dark Souls trilogy, trying to challenge myself to describe the experience of playing it and using both philosophy and game design to understand what it all means. That video was a labor of love, but it was also pretty rough around the edges, and I've thought for a while about exploring some of those themes and ideas a bit more at an individual level, not worrying about the larger context or any other bells and whistles beyond just developing one narrow thesis about a video game and how I relate to it. If you want something longer, it's there, but here and now I want to talk about our culture and Dark Souls 3. Something I've often found with debate around this game in particular is that its storytelling is the most hidden and obtuse, but also the most unsubtle when it does assert itself. So there's a weird overlap of people who think the game barely has any story at all, and people who assume that we all know what the story is. I'd probably be making a mistake if I talked to you like we all know the story of this game, so let me introduce you to my recent run and how it went. For this particular run, I decided to try out a sorcerer build with the understanding I probably wouldn't take this character to New Game Plus, so I'd cap off at around 40 intelligence and the usual low-end soft caps for other base stats. I wanted there to be a strong chance heading into the DLCs that I could get away with some Soul Spears and Pestilent Mercuries. I've heard people say Sorcerer is the toughest build in Dark Souls 3 for PvE, but those people didn't go to the Zero Lenny and IGN school for cheeseburger mages. I was pleasantly surprised by everything from the mid-game onwards, so maybe if you're like me and you've played a ton of Dark Souls 3, you'll find the gameplay on screen silly and awkward, but there was a lot of fun in that. More importantly, it allowed me to roleplay the Scholar for what I was about to do. In the opening cutscene of the game, the narrator tells us that the pilgrims discover the truth of the old words, the fire fades, and the lords go without thrones. We see the pilgrims in question collapsing into a sea of ash in a crumbling kingdom that looks nothing like the world we get to start out in, or the world we slowly explore over the base game's duration. Actually, this beginning scene looks like it takes place during the end of the final DLC, the Ringed City. That's a little weird, right? Hold on to that thought. We're going to talk about one of the hidden endings to Dark Souls 3 and what I think it says about humanity, and this scene is the key. If we venture far enough to witness the undead settlement, we can see a bunch of these undead pilgrims perishing in their journey. This landscape looks quite a bit different from the one we saw, but that's no surprise. It's a usual theme that time and space are uncertain, and that the player or other characters might traverse them unevenly. One pilgrim remains, Yoel of Londor. The introduction of the sorcerer Yoel is our first clue as to the nature of the Hollow Pilgrims and what they represent. I have to stress that this isn't a true lore theory video, but more of an essay about what I think the story of this game means for us as human beings. In any case, Yoel of Londor transmits the dark sign to the player a few times over if the player should accept Yoel's service. In order to attain the maximum number of signs from Yoel, the player must receive one for free, and then the others as they become progressively more hollow upon death. This was a mechanic fronted in the previous two games, but here it is only acquired by virtue of doing this actually entirely missable questline for one of the secret endings. If Yoel transmits 5 dark signs, previously understood to be a curse borne by the undead, then Yoel will die and be replaced by Yuria. We can glean from some of her dialogue that Yuria serves the Church of Londor, with the aim of fulfilling the wishes of the Serpent Koth, to raise up a usurper lord, to usher in the Age of Man, or in this case, the Age of Hollows. A word about the previous games. In Dark Souls, we can choose to relink the fire or usher in the Age of Man, an Age of Dark. In Dark Souls 2, it's more or less outright stated that so many cycles of fire have gone by that the older areas, the bosses and characters, are all lost to time. But intriguingly, in the Scholar of the First Sin update to Dark Souls 2, we meet Aldia, who has the potential to give us a second ending as an alternative to sitting on the throne. We are asked to give him our answer. Will we choose light or dark? Or perhaps will we choose something else entirely? The alternative ending is one where the player walks out of the throne room to seek insatiably they know not what. It's a somber and beautiful ending full of uncertainty. Dark Souls 2 introduced uncertainty into the certainty of Dark Souls, and now Dark Souls 3 collapses uncertainty into certainty again. In Dark Souls 2, Aldia tells the player that, once the Lord of Light banished dark, and all that stemmed from humanity, and men assumed a fleeting form. These are the roots of our world. Men are props on the stage of life, and no matter how tender, how exquisite, a lie will remain a lie. In the DLCs of Dark Souls 3, the player first enters into a rotten painting in order to show the little painter girl flame, such that she can be inspired to paint a new world to replace the old. The painter of the current world resists this process in conjunction with Uria's sister, Frida. The Church of Londor is being directly associated here, not just with the Age of Dark, but specifically with the inability to move on from the old world. Isn't that a curious thing? Well, maybe not. If the endings of Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin are to be believed, whether we choose light or dark is less important than whether we question the dichotomy of the choice. Dark Souls 2 presents us with a struggle against a choice we can't understand, whose alternatives are not readily apparent to us. Yol's story might be over by the time we face our first Lord of Cinder, the main bosses of the game who must be returned to their thrones after abandoning the fire-linking curse, but the story of the pilgrims goes on. When we later face the Dragon Slayer armor boss, it's animated by a massive pilgrim butterfly, like an evolved life form, born from a deceased pilgrim. We see another version of this in the Ringed City DLC, where the pilgrim summoner bugs summon the angels to attack the player. It's like all these pilgrims are realizing that the fire-linking tradition has failed, and all the thrones are unoccupied, and they're condemned to die, and in dying to be transformed. Whose thrones, though? We might have assumed, upon the base game's release, that the Lords Without Thrones were the Lords of Cinder, because of course that's how the Firekeeper says the phrase when we interact with her. However, when someone says they discovered the truth of the old words, the implication is generally that an old saying was given new meaning. How would that be true if the Firekeeper is just now saying them? Even if they were said before, it's not like this process gives them new meaning. But we have to remember the old context. The opening cinematic presents the pilgrims dying in the ashes that we finally see again after shattering Filianor's egg and seeing the world fall into its final state, where we fight Slave Knight Gale. So, in this sequence, what new meaning would be given to the term, the fire fades and the lords go without thrones? Well, the dark rises with the fading of the fire. The ascendancy of the Dark Soul midway through Gale's fight appears to imply the Age of Fire is at its lowest point, faded like never before in the wake of endless rekindlings. Now, truly, with the fall of the Ringed City of the Pygmies, the fire has faded, and as we see, now the Pygmy lords go without thrones. There's a funny symmetry here. The Lords of Cinder fled the rekindling of the first flame, and thus abandoned their thrones, whereas the Pygmy lords abandoned their thrones by clinging to them as the Age of Fire was rekindled over and over, until finally they were killed or chased down by Gale, so that their blood could be subsumed into a single vessel for the Dark Soul, to create the pigment for the little girl's painting. What's interesting about Gale's plan is that it would appear to be the perfect fulfillment of the Church of Londor's plan. It uses the Dark Soul to create a new world. Isn't that copacetic with their ambitions? Well, listening to characters like Yol and Yuria talk, it becomes apparent that they believe that the Hollow is the true face of mankind. I think that's sad. I leveled this character specifically to be a kind of pilgrim sorcerer who would follow the Church of Londor in their plan to usurp the fire, but who would find a better way. The Dark Souls 3 DLC, The Ringed City, makes it clear that what Aldia said was true. The Lord of Light, Gwyn, banished dark. But which face of man is the lie? The dark sign is given to the player, who is born of unkindled ash left over from burning remains, by Yol. It was originally inscribed on the Pygmies by Gwyn. The roots of mankind were poisoned by Gwyn's ambition, and now figures like Yuria mistake our nature. In that light, it makes sense why Yuria and Frida would behave as they do. Their motives are connected, and so they're united by their ideology as much as by their mutual connection to a mysterious figure like Velka. Because we are unable to distinguish our nature from our circumstances, there are times when oppression can appear to be our fate just because it is our history. But Aldia is right about one thing. We might not be able to imagine what awaits us, but no matter how it may appear, a lie will remain a lie. There's an emphasis on the distinction between appearances and the real thing. Human nature is not necessarily hollow just because of the appearance of the dark sign. We find out through both what is spoken and what is written in the games that Gwyn imposed the dark sign on humanity. The proliferation of the dark soul, one of the great souls by the furtive pygmy, gives to all humans fragments of its dark nature. But what is the dark? Is the fear of the dark representative of its nature, or of what is imposed upon it, what moves in the dark, what uses the dark? Gwyn, in a certain sense, used the dark as much as the furtive pygmy did. The introduction to this essay contains a quote from Karl Marx's work, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, or The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which to my mind evokes very much the horror of the weight of the fire-linking tradition established by Gwyn. Louis Bonaparte, also called Napoleon III, was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, also called Napoleon I. The title, however, also contains a reference, the 18th Brumaire in question, to the dictatorship of Napoleon I, which Marx compares to the dictatorship of Napoleon III. This is where his famous quote, Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce, originates, as he compares the two dictators and their dictatorships. Things are not always as they seem. The present may adopt the appearance of the past, but its further development into the future reveals its alternative nature. As a contemporary parallel, I would deploy this same rationale for two familially unrelated but symbolically and ideologically eminently comparable gentlemen, President Ronald Reagan and President Donald Trump. First, we have the tragedy of the insinuation of the influence of the John Birch Society into presidential politics, followed by the tragedy of the neglect of the AIDS crisis, the controversy of the Iran-Contra affair, Reagan's private anti-black racism, and his covert mental decline in his later years. Second, we have the farce of Donald Trump, chosen, at least in part because of and despite his public bigotries and overt mental decline, which made him both entertaining and impossible to thwart by way of reveal of his true nature, whose presidencies contained such marked events as the public assassination of the Iranian leader, Qasem Soleimani, as well as the active persecution of transgender Americans and the open welcome of far-right figures into the White House, including white nationalist Stephen Miller. Both gentlemen appeared as entertainers gone political. Both charmed a largely conservative audience with their rhetoric, and both have enacted fiscal policy to enable a massive transfer of wealth from the proletariat to the bourgeoisie. To say the American economy has been decimated by Reaganomics and Trump tariffs would be an understatement of a counterfactual order. To decimate is to take as a tenth, whereas these gentlemen have taken from the 9/10ths and given to even fewer. They have indecimated America. In the process of the Trump-led movement's attempt to make America great again, many have asked, when was America great? In some respects, this is the wrong question. We have made America tragic again, and in doing so made it farcical. We are rekindling the old world in search of a new age. This is a contradiction in terms. This is not to say that all notions of progress are moralistically good, but rather that the function of this method of rekindling America, of rekindling the world, is itself a destructive process incapable of creation. In Gwyn's further Ages of Fire, the world slowly is folded in on itself. Time and space begin to overlap, then to collapse, then to fall into nothing. In the end, the rekindling yields only ashes. Meanwhile, the order of the world is obscured by impositions. In my recent playthrough, I went all the way through Yol and Uria's questline. I married Henri, I met Frida, I even fought multiple bosses, including the Soul of Cinder, alongside the Hollows of Londor. But in the end, I could not bring myself to initiate the Age of Hollows. The truth about the ending of Dark Souls 3 as I see it is that it resolves the ending of Dark Souls 2, just as Dark Souls 2 questioned the ending of Dark Souls. The Lord of Hollows is just that, a lord of hollow ambitions, heir to the thrones of servants, inheritor of a kingdom of misconceptions. Dark Souls 3 is a world trying desperately to escape its endless farces, and now I am convinced that we live inside Dark Souls 3. If we attempt to remake the past, we're doing something even worse than living in a fantasy. We're dedicating our own destruction to a world that will no longer persist to witness it. It is the role of new generations, maybe, to bear the weight of those that came before, but not, I think, to mistake our history for our fate. Only those who are kin to history may make the new world, and those who are obsessed with history to the point of willing themselves to exist in it must not make the new world. And, as always, don't you dare go hollow.